Hi, everyone. I am Rhonda Huismann. I've got Jeff Kummer from Deloitte's national office here with me. Hi, Jeff.
Afternoon. How are you doing?
Good. Welcome back. It has been. It's hard to believe that. At least I feel like I blinked, and we are now 2.5 months into 2022, and it's been before the new year that we last spoke and had one of these podcasts. So. I'm sure there's a lot and maybe not a lot that's happened. Maybe you can bring us up to speed on what's happened since we last spoke.
Sure, happy to do that. And if you think about this, we went back to the last time we did one of these, I think was in mid-December. And at that time, the House had approved a roughly $1.7 trillion spending package called the Build Back Better Act. And it included about $1.5 trillion worth of tax increases impacting both individuals, high net worth individuals, and businesses as well. And we were teeing up potentially to see a vote in the Senate on their version of Build Back Better tax and spending legislation prior to the end of the year, prior to the Christmas holidays. Mm-hmm. But that kind of all ground to a halt. Senator Manchin said that he could not support the House approved, that Democratic approved vision. And so everything kind of ground to a halt. And then we kind of fast forward a little bit into January. And what we saw happen was the Senate really spent most of January focused on an expansion of voting rights legislation. And so not much discussion around Build Back Better or whatever the latest iteration of that is. And then we moved into February and we've seen a couple of really sort of unforeseen developments that Washington now has to focus on. That have become essentially competing priorities for this legislation. One is Supreme Court Justice Breyer's announced retirement and the nomination of Judge Jackson to fill that seat. So that set off a confirmation process now in the Senate that Senate Democrats are hoping to conclude by the middle of April. And then, of course, what's happening in the Ukraine and in Eastern Europe certainly has reset the whole discussion in Washington, both on Capitol Hill and on the White House. The focus is now externally on what's happening overseas. The focus is on energy policy here in the U.S. And that has sort of taken that wind out of those sails, if there was some wind that was moving related to this Build Back Better discussion. A third sort of competing priority is government funding. The federal government is scheduled technically to run out of money at midnight on this Friday night. I don't think that will happen. I think that the House and Senate will approve spending legislation to keep government doors open. But that is something else that, again, takes time away as members are more focused on that in the near term than perhaps they are on this tax and spending discussion. But we haven't forgotten about it. If you go back to March 1st, the president in his State of the Union address, it's very interesting. Nowhere in there did he mention the words Build Back Better. But what you heard a lot of is Building a Better America, sort of BBA. But when you actually listen to what he was saying, the concepts sounded very similar. He referenced upper income individuals paying more tax, large corporations paying more tax, spending priorities that the White House is focused on. So it sounds like it's been repackaged a little bit. But again, the reality is that Senator Manchin is really the centerpiece of this discussion, and his thoughts really matter as that 50th vote, because remember, as we discussed last fall, this is all being done under the guise of budget reconciliation, which is that special set of procedural rules that allows, particularly important in the Senate, that allows the majority party to circumvent the need to have any minority party votes. So you only need 50 votes in the Senate. Vice President can be a tiebreaker rather than the usual 60 votes that are needed under regular order. Of course, the significance of that is, as we know, the Senate has 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans in it. So that kind of sets the stage and gets us up to speed. Question is, where are we now? And then where do we think we're headed, I think? And I have a couple of observations. The first observation is, to my last point I just made, all of this is going to ultimately have to go through Senator Manchin's office. He still continues to echo concerns that he has related to inflation. Later this week, the newest inflation numbers will be released. Probably won't be better than what we saw last month and likely will be worse. He's going to point to that and say, why are we looking to do increased government spending in light of an environment where we have to focus on that increased cost that citizens are paying in the form of an increase in prices for durable goods and gasoline, groceries, and things like that. He's also concerned about deficits and the idea that, just sort of adding dollars, spending dollars to the federal government ledger without offsetting those in some particular way. And then he's also concerned, and this is really getting to the crux of the issues he had with that House Build Back Better legislation, is what he refers to as budget gimmicks. And the idea here is that that House approved bill had a number of spending programs in there that were funded for maybe a year or two. But this is being done under budget reconciliation, which has a 10-year lifespan. And his argument is that if you truly actually funded those programs permanently, the true cost would be much, much higher than the cost that was assigned to that legislation. So, the answer here is, I think, is that, it's really about refining those spending priorities to determine what Senator Manchin can accept, and then packaging those into a smaller version of this tax and spending legislation. In other words, if the House approved legislation had 10 programs that are only funded for 3 years, maybe you need to find 3 programs and that are funded for 10 years to help address those issues and those concerns that he has. So he is a centerpiece of this discussion. A second observation is there is about $1.5 trillion worth of tax increases. Again, a lot of that more on the large business side in the form of international changes, corporate book min tax idea, further restriction under thin cap rules for interest deductibility purposes. On the individual side, there's a surcharge, there's expansion of net investment income tax, qualified small business stock is affected, excess business loss limitations are extended and made more restrictive. There's a lot of tax increases in there, and by and large, congressional Democrats are fine with that. The issue is on the spending side of the discussion, not on the taxes. So there is a lot of tax increase sort of sitting there for congressional Democrats to absorb and use if they can decide on what spending priorities they want to put forward. Another observation is effective dates. As of now, the effective dates in those House approved proposals are sticking, and congressional Democrats would like to keep that. But as we know, particularly on the individual side, many of those are now retroactive back to January 1 of this year. Even in the case of qualified small business stock, retroactive now back to September of last year. And they're going to try to hold those effective dates as long as they can, but at some point, they're likely going to have to move on those and make those prospective. As we know, we're getting close. I'm sure, Rhonda, you're feeling this.
Filing dates and things like that.
Filing dates.
And then what do your taxpayers do once they've filed, facing amended returns, all of that? Those are all questions, I'm sure.
First quarter estimated tax payments, and what do you do? Do you make a payment based on what the law might be, retroactive back to the first of the year, or what the law is? And those are potentially, given these proposals, 2 significant different outcomes to think about. So just a reminder that those effective dates still sit out there, and something to pay attention to there. So if we're trying to put all of this into a context now going forward, I think, again, I think Build Back Better is off the table, right? Now we're talking about building a better America, or some iteration of that. I don't anticipate there being necessarily a lot of progress in the near term. I think, generally speaking, congressional Democrats know that Senator Manchin is the driver of this discussion. Senator Manchin did provide a few comments last week where he said that he could accept a spending package that focused maybe more on climate change provisions, and that had tax increases on both individuals and businesses in there, and also looked to garner additional spending savings in the form of allowing Medicare to negotiate lower prescription drug prices with pharma companies. So he's basically said you take spending savings and tax increases, and I would like to see about half of that used to pay for spending, the other half to be used for deficit reduction, which is, remember I mentioned earlier, his other sort of point here, that he's focused on those long-term deficits. And so last week really started, for the first time, we started to see a little bit of the parameters for what Senator Manchin could accept. So maybe there begins to be a path forward there, but I think we're going to see this play out for a while. Technically, the only real date congressional Democrats have to focus on is September 30th, which is the date of the end of the government's fiscal year. And it's the date that this whole budget reconciliation process potentially expires. And so they would have to start all over again after October 1st. I personally think that they really need to have this done sooner than that. If they're going to pass something, perhaps it's closer to July or June. Congress always leaves town for August. They come back after Labor Day, so that August recess, first week in August, maybe that's the timeline. But members are going to want to start to focus on those elections in November, and they're going to want to spend more time with their constituents. And perhaps for congressional Democrats, no better way would be to get this legislation passed and signed into law before they leave town in August for 6 weeks. And are back home with their constituents and their voters. So we'll see. I think there's, some more steps for this process to play out. And again, all of this gets superseded by what's happening in Ukraine, Supreme Court nomination confirmation process in the Senate. So every time it looks like Build Back Better or its latest iteration begins to come to the surface, it seems to get pushed aside by a competing priority. And that continues to be the case today. So we'll see. And I'm sure, Rhonda, will do another one of these when we have, as developments warrant going forward.
No, I'm sure we will. I guess a couple questions for you. Back in shortly after we had our last call, and Senator Manchin brought up the concerns about the budget gimmicks, I think you referred to it as, and I mean, it seemed like that gap was really large. Is it something they can overcome, and without it being so substantially different than what they first anticipated, or not?
So yes, I think it is going to be different than what certainly what congressional Democrats started out with last fall, because there was a $3.5 trillion spending package. Then what the House ultimately approved was about 1.75 trillion total over 10 years. And I think you're going to end up with something that is smaller than that. And it may be more focused on just the climate change and the energy provisions that were in that legislation. Senator Manchin seems to be pretty comfortable with that. And that really would help the U.S. meet global emissions targets that the president said the United States would agree to last fall at climate change talks in Glasgow in October. And so I think there's room for a path there to pass something that, and you say even just climate change. Well, in the tax incentive space, there's $250 to $300 billion worth of tax incentives and another $200 billion worth of spending initiatives folded into that House legislation that are clean energy, climate change, preserving jobs in the fossil fuel industry for states like West Virginia, where Senator Manchin's from. So there's a lot there. You could still see a $600 package, for example, significantly less than 1.7.
Yeah.
But you could see something smaller passed that is offset by tax increases, right? So it kind of all comes back to this conversation that we have on the CFMA tax committee, those proposals that may impact CFMA members most directly. Those are still on the table. And remember, there doesn't seem to be a lot of opposition. So it's really like the tax increases are more plug and play at this point. Yeah. Once they decide on the spending, they'll just decide which tax increases to plug in there to pay for it.
So it's a matter of when. And I guess that was my other question. So at what point, and I know you don't know the answer to this, but just from your experience, at what point is that tipping point? I mean, you mentioned July, August. I mean, at that point, this would be a year that we've been talking about this. Yes. But at what point is it, they're definitely not going to go all the way back to September of last year? And then at that point, do they just roll it forward with an effective date in your mind to January 1st? And that, taxpayers really need to be considering that it's very likely these items will come in for the current year, even if it's not for the prior year. I mean, what's your take on that? And I know you don't have answers, but
so it's a good question on those effective dates. So I think we're already, get close to second week of March. I think they're going to have to roll forward that September 14th, 2021 date. That as it relates to qualified small business stock, that capital gains exclusion for that stock. But the other ones that are still retroactive back to January 1, it's a good question. I kind of feel like we get around April 15th, it gets tougher to carry it back just for those taxpayers that have to make decisions around estimated tax payments. And so I feel like maybe that's a moment in time, but it's a good question. It could be June. And then would they roll it forward all the way to the beginning of next year? I think that's a possibility, because a lot of the business tax increases are set to tax years beginning on or after January 1 of 2023, not 2022. It's really the individual increases that are set to this year. So they could take their collection of individual and business tax increases and roll it forward to, so they're all consistent started January 1 of 2023. Now, we do have a history. It doesn't happen very often. We do have a history of mid-year tax changes, and they're the worst. I recognize that. So we would have to see, whether or not tax writers would want to try to impose, a July 1, for example. So you do a mid-year convention type change. I don't know. We'll know more, over the course of the next, 4 to 6 weeks, probably. But it is an excellent question. It's one that a lot of folks are paying very close attention to.
Well, and we will be here, as you said, to follow up and have these podcasts to keep our members informed. And so everybody listening, just stay tuned, and Jeff will be back to share more of this as it unfolds over the next few weeks. So any last comments, anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up here today?
No, just stay tuned and keep a close eye on Senator Manchin.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks so much, Jeff. As usual, this was great information, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.